The Weekly Show with David J. Maloney.
This week, David chats with legendary TV producer George Schlatter.
And now, here's your host, David J. Maloney.
Welcome, everyone, to The Weekly Show. I'm your host, David J. Maloney. On tonight's show, we've got a really special guest. He's responsible for some of the most memorable TV specials of all time and is directly responsible for producing what was, in its time, the #1 show in America, NBC's Laugh-In. His stories and experiences in the entertainment business are legendary, as are the many names of people he's called friends and colleagues. Here to chat about his incredible life and career, as well as his new book, Still Laughing, is none other than producer George Schlatter. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Our featured guest tonight is a television producer who truly left his mark on the business. For years, his show Laugh-In was the #1 show on television and helped shape America and American comedy forever after. He's worked with everyone who was anyone in the business at that time, from Goldie Hawn to Cher to Frank Sinatra to Lily Tomlin. Here to chat about his amazing career and new book, Still Laughing, is none other than producer George Schlatter. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Nice to see you again.
So, George, you've obviously went on to become one of the best producers in show business. What did your parents think of it all when you told them you were going to show business?
I never really told them. It's just that I did that. I failed at everything else, and show business was my last possible choice. But my mother was a concert violinist, and so I grew up with music, and humor was my salvation. Humor was my trapdoor I could escape. So laughing was the solution for everything.
So, Laugh-In being what it was, it made me think, growing up in, I guess, East Aurora and so many other places, were there ever any opportunities you had? What was the closest you'd ever gotten up to that point to actually meeting or seeing a star or celebrity at that point?
Well, I mean, East Aurora was where my mother was and so forth. And I came from East Aurora and I wound up in St. Louis and Missouri Valley College and football scholarships and so forth. Anyhow, I wound up in Hollywood and I got a job wrapping window cards for piano players. And so then I kind of failed up until eventually I got a job at Ciro's, which was a leading nightclub on Sunset Boulevard. And there was a thing that it ran in the paper that I'd been a bouncer at Ciro's, and my wife, Jolene, hated that. So we released a story that I'd been an executive in charge of emergency departures, which sounded better than bouncer. But I went on from there, and then eventually came into television.
It is kind of wild to think that, I mean, you were there almost kind of at the beginning of television, which I think was like early 50s. What was it like working in the medium in its infancy? I mean, were you guys literally creating the art form in real time?
Yeah, the technology didn't exist, and television was pretty much variety shows, and you did the show. You showed up and you did a live show, and it was exciting and it was dangerous. And so then eventually when videotape came in, it became still an adventure, but safer,
Yeah. Now, your time in the business producing shows, variety specials, working with bands and record labels and so on, you've worked with like so many of the luminaries of that age. And the one that shines brightest for many of us, you mentioned before the interview started, was Frank Sinatra. How did that relationship come about, and what do you remember about the first time you met the man himself?
Well, it was an adventure, and I met him when I was working at Ciro's, and he'd come in, and he always had a group of people around him, and he had an aura of danger, and he also loved to laugh, and so we met. I think probably the first time maybe was when I was at Ciro's. And I think he came in, as a matter of fact, he came in one night at Ciro's with Judy Garland. And we had a press agent that was a real pain in the ass. And he walked in, and Judy Garland was pregnant, and Sinatra walked in, and he said, "Who's the broad with Sinatra?" And Sinatra said, "Excuse me," took him, put him into a phone booth, punched him, and closed the door and said, "The lady's name is Garland." But that was my first encounter really with Sinatra punching our press agent. He was an adventure. He was, every time we met was another adventure. And the thing, my secret with Sinatra, the reason we got along so well is I made him laugh. And if you could make him laugh, you could do anything. But it was a dangerous way to pass the time, making him laugh, because you never knew whether or not he was going to think it was funny. Fortunately, I made him laugh.
So you mentioned earlier some of the shadier people, and you're one of the last people of a certain era and generation who I will probably ever be able to ask this question. But how influential or not was, like, say, the mob when it came to entertainment in those days? I mean, both from your nightclub days and onward, it seems you wound up, like you said, in and around a lot of some of the players in those days, including people like Mickey Cohen and John Stompanato.
Well, mob was a misnomer. Mob indicates a large group of people. Actually, they were a series of different individuals, most of them from a different city. And they took care of everything. And it was much cleaner then. But then when I married Jolene, she didn't want to hear any more about those people. So that was all behind me. When I came to do the book, right, Martha Bose, who worked for me, took all these notes from all the stories that I would tell people when they came by, and typed up all of those notes and then gave them to John Max, who took out all of the stories about those people. And so it became, Still Laughing became a very clean book of my wonderful memories, all of which were repeatable. Many of my memories are not in the book because of Jolene and Martha. But it's been quite a life. You know, when you figure how old I am, you'd think that I would have had a lot of adventures, and I did.
Well, also in and around the people that you're with. You know, back to Frank for a second. You talk glowingly about Frank in that book. What made that relationship so special for you, and how did you, as a producer, manage to manage the man and his known changing moods?
Frank Sinatra had the aura of danger, and everybody was kind of in awe of Sinatra. And I early on realized if I could make him laugh, I could get by with anything. So the secret of my relationship with Frank was making him laugh. And
so that was it, even managing him in any of those situations.
That's right. It broke that coil, you know, and so everybody was kind of afraid of Frank. But if you could make him laugh, you could get by with anything. And
just kill him with humor.
Up until his funeral, when Barbara Sinatra said to me, she wanted me to do one of the eulogies. And I said, Barbara, please, I don't want to do that. She said, you have to do a eulogy. So I said, okay. So I went to go up and I said, as long as I don't have to follow Gregory Peck. So sure enough, that Gregory Peck, and now then the bishop introduced me. And so I didn't know what to say. So I said, thank you, Your Honor. I'd met a lot more police or judges than I'd met bishops. So anyhow, that cracked it up, and it made the whole Sinatra funeral a little funnier. But that was my relationship with Sinatra was bumpy. It was exciting. It was dangerous. But boy, was it fun. He was a very, very special guy. One time Don Rickles was going to appear at the Slate Brothers. And so I took Frank in to meet Don Rickles, which was an unbelievable meeting because Frank had never seen anything like this. And so Rickles made him laugh. And from then on, they had a relationship. And so the secret with Sinatra was humor. Because then it was danger. He was dangerous, yes, and he knew a lot of dangerous people. But if you could make him laugh, the world lit up.
Judy, you mentioned Judy Garland earlier, and she was another who had a reputation who might have been periodically challenging to work with. And yet you found success and built a wonderful relationship with her as well. Is it true you threatened to drown her the first time she started snapping at you on a set?
Well, it was a secret with Judy was also making her laugh, and so she was a coiled thing like this, and everybody was afraid of Judy, so I realized if you could put her out there and make her laugh, break that coil, you could get by with anything, a lot like Frank, and so it was always making Judy laugh, and when she laughed, the world laughed. And I cherished the times I had with Julie, but that was also dangerous times because you never knew whether she was going to show up or not, and who was going to show up because she was different people.
The comedy's not lost on me. I mean, I know there was a story about maybe her running after you with the lamp or something like that. And the comedy's not lost on me imagining America's darling running after you with a lamp. And like, it was so, how did that story come about?
Well, we were doing something, and what happened was she was very, very vulnerable to any kind of fatulation. And if you played that sound for Judy, she cracked up. And so she was being very difficult at one time, and I played that sound, and she cracked up, and she said, "I'm sorry." So I said, "See that it doesn't happen again." And she reached up and grabbed a lamp and pulled it off the wall, and she chased me out of her dressing room down the hallway with this lamp. And the idea of me, who desperately wanted to do the Judy Garland show, having blown it with one comment, being chased by this legend with a lamp, cracked me up, and I just fell down laughing, and she fell down laughing. So the whole episode lasted only a few minutes, but she was so special, and she was magic. But the secret with Judy was breaking that coil, and that, again, as with Frank, if you could make her laugh.
So tell us about your relationship with Sammy Davis Jr. You guys got so close that you actually kind of bought a house or something for Sammy, right? Is there some story there?
Janice Page was opened in New York, and she's a huge star, and they needed an opening act. Well, Sammy was working at Larry Potter's in the Valley. Sammy was this tap dancer. He was part of the Will Maston trio. And so I went out and I got Sammy to open the show. And the thing was, he was going to do 10 minutes, and then Janice Page was going to come out. Well, Sammy saw this star-studded audience and didn't get off. He did an hour and 10 minutes. And it was just stunning what he did. He did everything. He played every instrument and danced and sang and did impressions. And from then on, he never opened another show. From then on, he was a big, big star. But my relationship with Sammy was based upon my relationship with the Will Maston trio. Will Maston was his uncle, and they did a trio, tap dancing. And so it was the Will Maston trio. Then it was the Will Maston trio with Sammy Davis, then starring Sammy Davis. Then it was Sammy Davis and the Will Maston trio. Eventually it became just Sammy Davis. And anybody who ever saw that act was in awe, because he did everything. He played, he sang, he danced, he played all the instruments. And he was perhaps the most talented person I had ever worked with or ever did work with. And but we had a great relationship. And again, with Sammy, I could get him to do anything. And he loved Frank, and Frank loved him. Frank, Dean, and Sammy, and Joey Bishop. And the secret with all of them was the fact that they were an event. When they played Vegas, and Dean Martin would do the first show, and he'd go out into the casino and deal. And Dean had been a deal in Steubenville. He'd been a dealer. So he had big hands, and he could deal anything. So he'd go out into the casino between shows and deal at the crap table, at the card table, and pay off everybody, right? 21, that's 25, that's a winner. And he was paying everybody on every hand. And they said, he can't do that. He's paying the wrong people. I said, you know how many people are in this building because because Dean Martin is dealing? And but then eventually they made us stop having Dean deal. But it was an adventure to be with the three of them. And then eventually they decided they were going to all appear together. And there were five of them: Dean, Frank, Sammy, Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford.
Yep.
The deal was each one of them was going to do a separate night. But eventually, when they all showed up together, they realized how much fun they were having as a group. And so they just did pure tumult in Vegas, which was at that point was dangerous. It had been unheard of. Acts came on, they did an hour so that people could gamble. So these guys stayed on as long as they wanted to. But the amount of gamblers overcame the fact that the shows ran too long.
Well, also probably the nature of, they probably had some higher stakes players who would come for that too, I would think.
Oh boy, yeah. They did. And but it was, see, I don't think that exists. It's I don't think it exists anywhere today. Nobody has that kind of freedom today. But boy, when they hit that stage, the world lit up. Now,
Cher is another luminary who you've worked with, someone who truly larger than life. You had, many experiences with her. But what is there a Cher memory that still sticks out as kind of like the the story to tell all these years later?
All of my memories of Cher stick out. I mean, she was married to Sonny, and she was kind of quiet and in the background, and Sonny was the boss. You know, Sonny, whatever Sonny said, that's what they did. So when Sonny died, and there I was with Cher, she was not going to let another man tell her what to do. And so our relationship was somewhat confrontational because she would wind up doing it, but she was reluctant. But I enjoyed her because this was a multi-talented lady who could do so much. So the first show we did was Cher, Bette Midler, and Elton John. And we put this thing together, and we built this whole stage with them and their costumes and whatever. And they came out and they did this live show. And Cher, from that moment on, Cher was a star before that, but from that moment on, she was a legend because she just absolutely captured the audience. Cher was a challenge because she had never let another man tell her what to do, but she would come out on that stage. Once you got her out there, she would be late, but once you got her on that stage, there was some magic happen. It still does. I mean, she still is a good friend.
So up to this moment, we've kind of been touching in and out of your time and memories, but I now want to focus on what was in its day the #1 show on television in America, Laugh-In. What was the moment that the idea for Laugh-In first came to you?
Well, the problem was Monday night at 8 o'clock, we were opposite Gunsmoke and Lucy.
Oh, wow.
NBC was getting no rating at all.
Those are big guns, too. Yeah. Literally, and one of them figuratively.
1 and 2 show by a large margin. And so they said, what are we going to put on Monday night at 8 o'clock? Well, I've got an idea. I've got a show, and I've got this group of totally unknown people. And so NBC said, yeah, go ahead. They had nothing else to put on Monday night at 8 o'clock. So the first night, they didn't know what the hell it was. This isn't a television show. And I took it to a school, and I said, the kids are laughing. They get it. How come you don't? Because it was a totally different experience. These flash cuts and the mistakes and everything. So we did one show, then 2 shows. By the 3rd show, the audience started to get onto it, and we began to get a rating. Well, I mean, I'm arrogant now, but you should have seen me, that many years ago with the 50 share. We'll forget about it. So we could do everything, and Laugh-In was an adventure. And we didn't have the money. See, to get the show on the air, I promised everything and guest stars and whatever. But when we started to do the show, we didn't have any money for guest stars. So we would go out in the hall and stop people coming from the Johnny Carson show and say, would you do the show? And like John Wayne said, I'm not going to do that show. I'm not going to say Sock It to Me. We put that on the air. We put all the people saying they weren't going to do the show became the cameo stars. So by the end of the first week, 4 weeks, we had everybody in the world that had done the Johnny Carson show coming on laughing, saying they weren't going to do the show. And then they realized that it was an adventure, that with mistakes, we let them in. Mistakes became a major part of Laugh-In. But Laugh-In went on with this group of totally unknown people. Dan and Dick were a nightclub act, and they did, Dick being dumb and Dan being articulate. And they came on and they would talk for 10, 12 minutes. We would take that and cut it down to 2 minutes and put that on the air, and it worked. And so it became, it was a new kind of show business because at that point we had just come up technically so we could edit. And so when we could edit these 10-second and 15-second sound bites and put that all together in a post-production schedule, we got a lot of stuff done that had never been seen before. And Jolene, my wife, had been a Miss Rheingold, and she also was on the Ernie Kovacs show. And Ernie loved Jolene, and Jolene would show up and never ask what was she going to do. And Ernie would just have her do these crazy things. They've got a shot of her in the bathtub with a periscope coming up out of the bathtub. And so Ernie had a big effect on me. But that was the visuals on Laugh-In. A lot of that came from my relationship with Ernie Kovacs. But the fact that you could now do technically all the stuff that had never been even thought of before. And we put that on the air. And by about the 3rd or 4th week, people said, wait a minute, there's something exciting happening there. And then it took off. And I'm arrogant now, but you can imagine me that many years ago with a 50 share. Forget about it. And that would recover. And
what do you remember about the first pitch meeting for Laugh-In? Who all was there, and How did you sell that?
Well, I really didn't. It was the fact that they had a Monday night at 8 o'clock. They had literally no rating. NBC had no rating at all. And so I said, well, I'll give you a show. And they said, what is it? And I said, you're not going to understand it. So we took all of these people that I'd collected. None of them were movie people. None of them were basically singers and dancers. They were young character people. We put all of them on, and we edited it together with the new editing techniques that Carolyn Raskin developed. And so we came on the air with this explosion, and NBC said, what the hell is that? And I said, well, it's called Cinema Verte. And I made it up. I never knew what Cinema Verte. So Erwin Siegel's thing called, Erwin, come in here. Do you ever hear Cinema Verte? So the assistant was in the other room, said, yeah, it's big on the continent. He hadn't heard of it either. But Laughing was based upon a lie. It was based upon Dan and Dick standing there, very straight, in tuxedos, playing a nightclub act. And then all of these people came in, all Goldie and Artie and Lily and Joanne. And the fact is, because of the way we taped, they could do many, many characters. Like Lily Tomlin would come in and do 4 characters in 1 hour, and Goldie came out, and I saw, Carolyn Raskin saw this young dancer. She said, there's a dancer downstairs that you ought to see. I said, I'm not using dancers, I'm using comedians. She said, you got to see this girl. So I went down, and here was Goldie Hawn. And I brought her up to the office. She sat down in this big red leather chair. And she said, well, I don't do that, everything. But she was so adorable. So we gave her an introduction of Dan Rowan to do as her first appearance. And she did this introduction, and she got so screwed up, it was hysterical. She said, oh, I'm sorry, I'll do it again. And she heard me say, no, Goldie, that'll be just fine. And from then on, she never got a chance to rehearse. So Laugh-In was Goldie was this adorable child. She was a good dancer, but she never even got a chance to dance straight. But that came in, and then Artie Johnson came in with all of these characters, and Lily Tomlin came in with multiple characters. And nobody had ever done a show like that before, because you couldn't do it technically. You couldn't edit videotape like that. Carolyn Raskin developed these editing techniques. So we came on, and we would be editing. At one time, we were shooting the show at one end of the hall at NBC and still editing at the other end of the hall. So there was the element of danger and adventure in Laugh-In, and then it took off, and it just became huge. And sponsors would complain about what we were going to do, and I'd say, why don't you cancel it? No, they wouldn't. We did a salute to smoking one week when we had a cigarette sponsor. We smoking is good for you, no matter what they say. Smoking is good for you, so just ignore the AMA. And it was a total put down of smoking, right? Yeah. And they said, we had a cigarette sponsor. They said, you can't do that, cigarette. But I took it to the sponsors, and I said, you want the rating or you want the commercial? They put that on the air, and they put our salute to smoking next to the smoking commercials, and the cigarette companies were thrilled with it. And so it was taking chances. I don't see anybody taking chances anymore. Laugh-In was an adventure every week with the cast, with Artie Johnson popping up saying, very interesting. To put a German officer on opposite CBS was unheard of. And good night, Lucy. And saluting Lucille Ball, who was our opposition. And NBC said, you can't she's the opposite you. I said, guess what? She's got a 50 share. Who cares what's opposite her? And see, what I don't see today, I see language that I'm not crazy about. I don't see adventure. And Laugh-In was a total trip. It was like a free fall. And I don't see anybody taking those chances today.
That's our show for tonight. Thank you so much for watching, and a special thanks to producer George Schlatter for joining us. George will be back again next week for the next installment of our interview, so please tune back in. Stay safe, everyone.